Welcome to Hours of Service Training. This module covers the basics. Before we get too deep into the regulations, it's important for you to understand what it means to be regulated. Being regulated means a government agency is watching you and making sure you're operating safely. For compliance with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Regulations, there are 7 separate scores. The Hours of Service Compliance CSA Basic Score has the greatest number of driver violations. It measures how often drivers are likely driving tired or fatigued. Some studies suggest that operating tired is like operating under the influence of drugs or alcohol. It's dangerous for everyone on the road. So, Hours of Service Training Basics is designed to cover the fundamentals of hours of service regulations and what it means to be regulated. You will learn what activities you'll be expected to keep track of and which are considered on-duty or off-duty. You will learn the importance of tracking your rest cycles and amount of work completed, which will help you determine if you are safe and legal to drive. After completing this module, you'll be able to identify who the hours of service regulations apply to. Then, you'll recognize the purpose of the hours of service regulations and be able to differentiate between on-duty and off-duty activities. Finally, you'll be able to explain how hours of service violations affect you and your carrier's CSA scores. So, who is regulated? For the safety of all drivers sharing the road, compliance with the hours of service regulations has been required of commercial motor vehicle drivers since the 1930s. The hours of service regulations are contained in Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 395. Those regulations apply to CMVs involved in interstate commerce and cover the number of hours you are allowed to drive and work in a given period of time. Additionally, the regs apply to what you use to keep track of your hours of service. This log is also referred to as a record of duty status. Depending on your operation, it may be completed electronically or manually. The hours of service limits are regulated by both federal and state agencies. The hours of service rules don't limit how much work you can do, but they do keep you from driving once the limits are reached. That's right, this is Hours of Service Training and we're looking at limits. There are limits that measure the total hours of on-duty or work time and when your workday can begin. There are also limits that track how many hours of driving you've done so far. They include the 14-hour on-duty limit, 11-hour driving limit, and the 60 and 70-hour on-duty limit. And don't forget about the mandatory interrupt provision, which is also known as the 8-hour driving limit. There are 2 rules that make sure you've got enough off-duty time between work cycles. There's the 10 consecutive hour off-duty break rule. It's used before starting a new on-duty period that will include driving. And there's a 30 consecutive minute interruption of driving requirement when driving for more than 8 hours. The limits, rules, or clocks, as they're referred to, track either a consecutive or a cumulative period of time. These terms are used interchangeably depending on who you're talking to, but they all mean the same thing. A consecutive clock doesn't stop and start. It's like a timer for a race. The clock keeps ticking until the last racer is finished. A cumulative clock, on the other hand, can start and stop numerous times because it's timing a specific activity, not how long ago since the activity started. A football game clock is a good example of a cumulative clock. It allows exactly 1 hour of game time, although that time may be spread out over the course of several hours. When your livelihood depends on driving a commercial vehicle, it's best to know when you can't. You need to understand how all the limits, or clocks, work together, so you aren't operating a commercial vehicle when you're fatigued. This program is designed to help you understand how the clocks work together and keep you compliant with hours of service regs. We'll also help you to know when to take a break and when to rest to restart your hours. In fact, this module will help you recognize how fatigue requires you to stop driving even if you have hours left to legally operate, and help you identify off-duty activities that qualify as a 10-hour break. In addition, it will help you describe how the 14-hour limit is calculated, identify which duty status the 11-hour limit tracks, and determine when to use the 60 or 70-hour limit. Further, it will help you explain how to satisfy the 30-minute break required under the interruption of driving provision, and identify an exception which resets the 60 or 70-hour limit. And finally, it will help you differentiate between cumulative and consecutive limits. Being fatigued is often compared to driving while being under the influence of alcohol. Response times are diminished, alertness is decreased, and you may fall asleep behind the wheel. There are 3 types of fatigue: acute, cumulative, and circadian rhythm fatigue. If you're working over long periods of time, you can experience acute fatigue. And even though you're required to have off-duty periods between work shifts, there are no rules on how much sleep you must have. This is what can cause cumulative fatigue. This is Hours of Service Training, Recording Your Hours. The FMCSA expects proof that you're staying compliant with the limits. Recording hours is done electronically, manually, or by keeping a time record. Which one will you need to use? That depends on the type of operation, how often you drive, the equipment you use, and how far you drive. You need to know where you're going and how you're going to get there. That's where a trip plan comes in. The hours of service record at the end of a productive day will match up almost perfectly with the plan. It's no accident because there's no rush and no surprises. This program is designed to teach you when each type of record can be used and how each is evaluated during a roadside inspection. It also helps you with planning your trips to avoid violations. Today, we'll get you trained to explain how to use trip planning to achieve successful time management and to identify 2 important components of coercion. Additionally, we'll explain how supporting documents are used to validate recorded hours and when to keep track of your hours using an ELD, manual log, or time record. Finally, we'll look at how roadside inspection expectations differ between ELDs, manual logs, and time records. Complying with the hours of service limits does not just happen. It requires proactive trip planning and accurate record keeping. Recording your hours is a reaction to what happened, but how you will comply is something you can and should plan for. You can be proactive with hours of service compliance by planning your trip. Successful drivers take ownership of their outcome by establishing a plan. These drivers do not just hope to put miles on and get to a destination sometime. Trip planning applies to all drivers, not just over-the-road drivers. A good trip plan involves creating a vision of how the day should go. Might unexpected obstacles arise? Absolutely. So it's best to anticipate them and be strategic. Experienced trip planners don't use the speed limit to determine how long it will take to get from point A to point B. Instead, they'll subtract 10 to 15 miles per hour to allow for unexpected variables. The more variables used to develop a trip plan, the more accurate the plan will be. While there are things you can't know about in advance, like an accident, there are things that you can have insight about, like the weather forecast, planned detours and road construction, common rush hour traffic in larger cities, and established speed limits.
Almost every rule has an exception. It's no different with the hours of service limits. This is Hours of Service Training Exceptions. With hours of service, it's very important to know what exceptions you can use and how to use them. If you're a driver and can't explain an exception, you may end up with a violation because it'll look like a rule is being broken. Using exceptions properly and calling them out correctly will result in fewer violations. We'll be talking about these commonly used exceptions: the air mile radius short haul, the 16-hour big day, the split sleeper berth, and the adverse driving conditions. Others include ELDs, agricultural operations, and finally, personal conveyance. Your carrier may want to use certain exceptions, but not others. Keep current with your carrier's practices and policies. This course is designed to help you understand which exceptions can be used and when to use them. After completing this module, you'll be able to identify which drivers can use an hours of service exception and describe what an exception relieves a driver from. The air mile radius short haul exception makes an allowance for drivers that work differently than over-the-road truckers. These are drivers who operate near their normal work location and tend not to have driving as a major part of their workday. Driving may, in fact, be a big part of their day, but they have many stops. Short haul drivers are exempt from recording hours of service entries on an electronic or manual log. They're also exempt from the supporting document provisions and the need to have and record interruptions of driving time. Drivers that stay within the 150 air mile radius and meet other qualifiers can use the short haul exception if allowed by their carrier. Even so, a carrier can require all drivers to use an ELD, turn in all supporting documents, and take breaks or interrupt their driving time. In order to qualify for the air mile radius short haul exception, you must take a 10-hour break before starting your day. You'll also need to operate within 150 air miles of your normal work reporting location and begin and end your day at your normal work reporting location. Your carrier must maintain a true and accurate time record in lieu of a log for 6 months indicating your start time, release time, and total on-duty hours. Plus, the record must be identifiable in some way to you.
This is Hours of Service Training, ELD Basics. Welcome. Some things can be both easy and confusing at the same time. That is certainly the case when discussing electronic logging devices, or ELDs. While the technical standards are some of the most complicated of all the regulations, creating a duty status is easier and more accurate when using an ELD because much of the recording is done automatically. This training is designed to help you compliantly use ELDs and correctly use the special driving categories of personal conveyance and yard move. This will help you understand your role in reducing unassigned driving events, when to edit the record, and the importance of reviewing the record before submission. So after this, you will be able to discuss when you're required to use an ELD and identify the 4 items you must have in the cab when recording hours with an ELD. Additionally, you'll be able to describe how you can reduce unassigned drive time, explain the process to follow when your ELD malfunctions, and differentiate between coercion and harassment. Most drivers have been required to use electronic logging devices to record hours of service duty status changes for years now. ELDs increase compliance with the hours of service regulations and reduce fatigue-related crashes. Drivers that are required to complete a log need to use an ELD with a few exceptions. Drivers who are not required to use ELDs include short-haul drivers using the 150 air mile exception. Additional drivers that are not required to use ELDs include intermittent drivers, drive-away or tow-aways, meaning a vehicle being driven is part of a delivery, or any vehicle delivering an RV trailer, and finally, pre-year 2000 model vehicles and engines. The FMCSA requires you and your carrier to only utilize electronic logging devices listed on the ELD registry. These devices are certified by the ELD vendor to meet all technical specifications. The ELD final rule created significant technical requirements. Electronic logging devices need to be connected to the vehicle's electronic control module to acquire the required vehicle information.
Every driver needs to know how to complete manual logs. Most often, a manual log will be a paper grid log. Short-haul drivers who find themselves in a situation where they do not qualify for the 150 air mile radius exception, and ELD users who experience a malfunction of their device need to know how to manually record their duty status. This program is designed to help you avoid common logging errors by understanding which fields are required and which are optional on a manual log. You'll also learn how to accurately prepare your record of duty status and complete a recap to avoid violations. Welcome to Hours of Service Training, How to Complete a Manual Log. After completing this module, you'll be able to identify required fields that must be completed on a manual log, prepare a record of duty status using a manual log, and describe how to complete a recap to determine the number of hours a driver has available before hitting the 60 or 70-hour limit. Every driver required to complete a record of duty status needs to know how to correctly fill out a paper log. Even if you always use electronic logging devices, you must be capable of performing this task in the event your ELD malfunctions and you're unable to enter or recover logs from the device. When completing a manual log, every entry must be legible, be in your own handwriting, filled out in duplicate if not submitting an electronic copy, and be as current as your last change of duty status. The header information, like your carrier's name and address, can be pre-printed. All other required information must be completed by you. While the rules don't say what must be used, a black or blue pen is usually preferred. Ask your supervisor if your company has a policy on what color to use. A manual log has 11 required fields in addition to the grid and comment sections. If any required field is left blank, the omission is a violation. The required fields are date and total miles driving today. This one can be confusing. It's not necessarily the odometer miles. You only need to include miles that you recorded on your own driving line. The next fields are your truck or tractor and trailer number. Remember, you must include every CMV driven and trailer hauled and the name of carriers. This is the legal name of your carrier. It should not be a trade name or a division name. If you drive for more than one carrier in the same day, you need to list all the legal names. Next field, your signature and certification. You need to sign the record after the last entry of the day, certifying that the record is true and accurate. The starting time for the 24-hour day covered by the log is determined by your carrier for your terminal. After that, include the main office address. Now on to remarks. This field is sometimes referred to as the comment section. Use it to record the required location for each change of duty status. Every time your duty status changes, you must enter the name of the location where that change occurred. If a change of status is not in a city, town, or village, then you'll need to enter the highway number and nearest milepost, followed by the name of the nearest city, town, or village, and state abbreviation.